So today, we're pretty much done looking at single cells at this point. Now we're going to start talking about multicellularity. Okay, we're going to start looking at how that happens, what the mark of a true multicellular organism is, okay, how that's different and the same as being a single-celled organism, okay, from at least a transport point of view. They share a lot of the same transport mechanisms, but obviously a multicellular organism, being generally bigger, okay, needs sometimes more complex systems, okay, which obviously a single-celled organism doesn't have, right? We're also going to look at how multicellular organisms evolved, right? And we're going to look at that from the perspective of why that doesn't disagree with what you learned in religion class, okay? I will do my best to explain that, okay? So that's what we're going to look at today, is mostly just what multicellularity is. Okay, a couple of key words, right? Probably the most important word is going to be specialization. Okay, specialization is the mark of all multicellular organisms. It means that you have cells that are different from each other. All right, so the cells in your liver are different from the cells in your brain because they do very different jobs. Okay, and as a result, have different structure, okay, things like that, so that they can perform those jobs. Your liver cells are specialized to detoxify and filter your blood, whereas your brain cells, okay, nerve cells, are designed to send impulses, receive impulses, okay, things like that. So they would have obviously very different structure. A single-celled organism does not obviously have specialization. It's only one cell. Okay? And there are organisms that are not truly multicellular. Okay? They look like they're multicellular, but they're not, and that's because they don't have specialization. All their cells are identical. All right? Everybody with me on that? Okay. Okay, so what we see in the fossil record is that multicellularity appeared multiple times. Okay, it evolved independently multiple times. Okay, when we see something like that in the fossil record, it generally means that that structure or that ability is important and advantageous. Right? Now, whilst not all of the branches of that tree have survived through to the present, multicellularity has in general. Okay? And as a result of that, okay, we can conclude that multicellularity is an advantage over being unicellular, at least in many, many cases. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. All right. The most widely held view is that multicellular organisms and their unicellular ancestors, the link between them is colonies of cells. So cells that grouped together for mutual advantage. Okay, because becoming larger meant that you were less susceptible to predation. Okay, I mean, if you're bigger, less things can eat you. All right, so that's definitely an advantage. If you are cooperating with others, your ability to capture your own food and collect food is greatly increased. So being in a group, okay, was a survival, was an advantage in terms of survival, right? And then from there, natural selection would have selected for increased specialization from there. Okay, so to start off with, for this like natural selection, evolution kind of thing, we need to make sure that we don't confuse those two things. Okay, natural selection is the mechanism by which evolution occurs. Okay, evolution is the long-term change in a species, not in an organism. An organism cannot evolve. All right, I can't evolve into something other than what I am already. Okay, I'm not Wolverine or somebody else like that. Okay, I cannot evolve into something else. My DNA is set, right? But if I have some trait that is advantageous, that allows me to survive better in my environment, I will likely reproduce more often and pass on my genes more often than some organism that is not as well adapted. Okay? If an organism is not as well adapted, it may be smaller, weaker, okay? It may die outright, okay? Or just be so weak that it doesn't reproduce and pass on its genes very well, okay? If at all, right? In that case then, the genes that were not well suited to the environment were eliminated, right? The genes that were well suited to the environment or well adapted survive and were passed on, okay? That's natural selection. That process over the course of thousands of years can lead to a change in the species. Okay, it's not immediate. We see it as immediate when we look at the fossil record and we go, oh, look, birds evolved from this ancestral reptile. See, it went to this and then this and then this and then this, and it makes it look like they just magically were these big jumps. Okay, the reason it looks that way is we don't find the fossils of everything in between. Okay, we just have to kind of put the piece to get the puzzle together, missing some pieces in the middle. Okay, so does everyone kind of follow the difference between natural selection and evolution? Okay. All right, so lots of times I get the question, Coder, you're telling us that evolution's a real thing, and the Earth is 4.5 or 4.6 billion years old, and all this stuff doesn't agree with what the Bible said, because the Bible said that the Earth was created in 6 days, right? That's what the Bible says, and I'm not discounting the Bible, but here's what you have to understand. Okay, the Bible was written at a time when most people were illiterate. Okay, only very few people actually had a Bible. Okay, in fact, you had to be pretty high up in the ranks to own a book at that time. Okay, so the Bible was written so that people that had the privilege of looking at it would be able to teach those who did not. Okay, now you have to understand that most people's lives around that time centered around making sure they had enough food to not starve to death. Okay, life was very different. Okay, they didn't have time for leisure and things like that. They didn't have time to learn to read, most of them. Right, so they had to rely on their leaders to tell them, okay, about things. So if their leader back at this time, when people were illiterate and their main concern was getting enough food on the table, had come to them and said, okay, so like 5 billion years ago, the sun coalesced into this, from a ball of, or from a cloud of gas, it coalesced into a ball, and nuclear fusion started, and that created light and warmth, and throughout the cloud there was debris, and that debris coalesced into planets, and they grew and formed. What would have happened to that person? The answer is they would have had rocks thrown at them until they were dead. It's called stoning. Okay? It's what they used to do to people who were determined to be witches and things like that, or if they went against kind of the word of the law and stuff like that. So that's what would happen to them. So they had to explain the miracle that is the creation of the earth in a way that made sense to people. Okay? They also wanted to use a context that fit in with what people understood. Okay? Especially at that time, 7 days was a very sacred amount of time. Right? And so what they said is, okay, God did this on one day, and then he did this, and then he did this, and on the 7th day he rested, which is why the Sabbath day, okay, is so important. You're supposed to rest on that day, okay, just like God did after he created everything, right? It's not meant to be taken literally, okay? The whole 6 days of creation was never meant to be taken literally. In fact, Pope Francis came out and said this about 2 years ago. He said, please understand that evolution and faith do not disagree. Okay, they are saying exactly the same things, but one is figurative and the other is concrete. Okay, and that's what we were meant to understand. If you're a fundamentalist, okay, and there are people out there who are fundamentalists, then you believe in the literal truth of the Bible. Okay, if that's the case, then you believe the earth is about 5,000 years old. Okay, it was created in 6 days, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and if that's your belief, that's your belief. Okay, what we as Catholics believe is that the Bible says this as a means of telling us a story. Okay, it's the right story. It just didn't happen in 6 days. Okay, it took a long, long time because God's a smart guy. Okay, he would have had to plan for his kind of penultimate creation. Okay, his ultimate creation would have been us. Okay, he wanted to create us in his image. We were kind of his special thing. Okay, so he had to know that he couldn't just set this all up. He needed it to grow and develop. Right, so the whole kind of let there be light thing. Okay, we could interpret that as the Big Bang. Okay, that would have been very bright, I would imagine. Giant explosion created everything. Kind of big, okay? Or it could have been, okay, that it was the formation of the sun, okay? And then there's, separating light from darkness, and there's, separating the land from the sea, and all of this kind of stuff. It all goes in the right order, okay? All of what it says in Genesis is the right order, okay? It's the order in which things happen. So if we're looking at that from a scientific point of view, okay, as well as from our faith point of view, Okay, 4.6 billion years ago or so, okay, the Earth was basically a molten ball. Because at that time, okay, it's a time that we often refer to as the late heavy bombardment. It's just as violent as the name would imply. Okay, during that time, there was a lot of debris floating around in the solar system because the planets hadn't all fully formed yet. So lots of stuff smashed into each other. Okay, and when it did that, obviously there was, a kind of collection. So when big objects run into each other, they don't just break. They break a little bit. But when they break, there's also a lot of heat. Usually they become molten and will kind of congeal back together. And that process was what formed a lot of the rocky planets in the inner solar system, okay, including the Earth. Now, all of this material, okay, contains all the stuff that the Earth is made out of. Okay, so it's got rock, it's got water, okay, other gases, all of that kind of stuff is all present. As that bombardment continues, okay, it starts to get less and less frequent. That's why we call it the late heavy bombardment. Okay, then there's the periods of time where there's less bombardment, which is good, okay, because every time you get hit by something, it kind of ends everything. So we're looking at when all of this, most of this bombardment is done. Okay, so that would be about 4.6 billion years ago. That would have been the last really big impact, and that would have been when we got the moon. Okay, so the moon was formed because a large, nearly Mars-sized object collided with Earth, which was at the time smaller. Okay, when they smashed into one another, okay, it wasn't a solid like head-on collision; it was kind of a glancing hit. Okay, and when that happened, the impactor, the other body, was essentially destroyed, shattered. Okay, and part of it merged with the Earth, which is why the Earth has a very heavy iron molten core. Okay, more than any other planet. And then the rest of the debris formed in a cloud, and it was also molten around the Earth, which eventually congealed to form the moon. Right, that's kind of the last big serious impact that kind of destroyed everything. Okay, formed and destroyed everything. So at that point, then the Earth starts to cool. It's not getting smacked around anymore by stuff from the solar system. Okay, and as it cools, okay, then clouds form and atmosphere begins to develop. Okay, rain starts to fall out onto the Earth, cooling it further, starting to collect, forming oceans, things like that. Okay, until we've got about 3.9 to 3.5 billion years ago. Okay, life originates. Single-celled organisms appear. Okay, that's the first time we see them in the fossil record. Okay, is that there's actually something capable of reproducing, okay, that is made of cells, okay, etc. So 3.5 to 3.9 billion years ago. So the Earth was effectively sterile for almost a billion years. Okay, so lots of ideas on how that happened. First off, we need to get the formation of organic material from essentially inorganic material. They've run experiments on this in the lab. And if you arc an electric current simulating lightning through the gases we believe made up the early atmosphere, you can actually form organic compounds like amino acids and hydrocarbons and stuff like that. So that's where the chemical part of it would have come from. Okay, and then there's the evaporating puddle hypothesis, which says that a lot of this material would have gathered in puddles that would slowly evaporate, concentrating the material, leading to the possible formation of membranes and things like that. Yeah. And there's a lot of kind of stuff out there, but a lot of it has got good scientific backing. Okay, so we've got these early organisms. They would obviously have been quite different from what lives here now because to us, Earth at this time contained a highly toxic atmosphere. Right? It would have been mostly carbon dioxide and ammonia and things like that. So these would have been photosynthetic organisms capable of taking the carbon dioxide and turning it into sugar, and then the oxygen they produced as a result could carry out cellular respiration to allow them to live. Okay, Earth continues to cool, okay, and we start getting more complex life to originate. So we got photosynthesizing bacteria are pumping huge amounts of oxygen into the atmosphere. Okay, when we do that, that further decreases the temperature of the Earth. Right, it removes all the greenhouse gases, okay, and starts creating this atmosphere that is much, much different. And in fact, that's what causes the first mass extinction that we see in the fossil record. Okay, is we have all these organisms that are taking all this noxious stuff out of the atmosphere and pumping it full of oxygen. It gets to the point where oxygen becomes toxic to most of the life that evolved in a non-oxygen atmosphere. All right, and so as a result, a lot of things die off just because there's these photosynthesizing organisms that are effectively poisoning them. Okay, so this with all the cooling, we get an excuse me, get an ice age, okay, and we get it just in the polar regions, okay, and we start seeing more complex living organisms, okay. To 2.1 to 1.9 billion years ago, oxygen's continuing to build. We've got large single-celled organisms, and the first multicellular organisms appear in the fossil record. Okay, so multicellular organisms have been around for less than half of Earth's history. Now, looking at this diagram, you can see this purple line here that's on the diagram. Okay, back here, its width represents the diversity of life on Earth. Okay, so you can see that very early on, there's basically no diversity, right? There's a few organisms, but that as time goes by, there's more and more different types of organisms. Not just more organisms, but different types of organisms. Okay, look what happens to that line once multicellularity occurs. Okay, it literally explodes after that. Okay, because multicellularity originating that was really the key for having lots of different kinds of organisms. There were lots of niches that needed to be filled, and with multicellular organisms came the ability to fill those. By the way, it is pronounced niche, not niche. Okay, niche is how you say it in French. Okay, niche is how you say it in English. Okay, niche. All right, so once we get to the multicellular organisms, then essentially the parade of organisms explodes. Now, on this diagram, we don't get to the present day. All we see here are things like trilobites and stuff that would have been in like the Precambrian era. And all life would have been in the ocean. Okay, this line gets even wider once you start making the journey to land. Okay, and of course plants were the first things to get on land. Okay, and then from there the animals, because there had to be food on land for them, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a long process. Okay, it's not something that happened immediately or quickly. Okay, but it is a process that did occur, and it doesn't disagree with what our faith tells us either. Okay, don't take this to say that the earth not being created in 6 days makes God less powerful or less amazing, because that's not true. Okay, to do all of this and to have this plan is something pretty incredible, right? To know that your creation's not going to be static, that it's going to change, okay, and making it ready, okay, for what you want it to make at the end. Okay, that's amazing. Okay, and to have kind of like, I guess, the patience to know that that's going to happen. Okay, that's kind of the amazing part of it. All right, questions on that? On both the scientific or the faith part of it.
This is just kind of like really random, but how do we know where the final destination is?
We don't. Yeah, we don't know that. We used to have a teacher here. His name was Mr. Dick was here, and he was our religion teacher. He was actually a superintendent for a while, and he came back to the classroom because he loved it. He was the best religion teacher I've ever seen, and his answer to your question would have been, enjoy the mystery. Right? We don't know that, and we're not supposed to know that. Okay? If we knew that, then we wouldn't have the free will that God wants us to have. Right? We'd feel stuck in this channel towards that, and that's not the way it's supposed to go. God gave us free will so that we could choose our own direction. Okay? Does he have a plan? Certainly. Okay? But our choices are part of that plan. Okay? Other questions? Okay. So, multicellularity. Okay? What distinguishes a multicellular organism from a colony of cells, which is what we see in this diagram here. Okay, this is a colony of cells because all the cells they're the same. Okay, is there an advantage to being together? Yes. Okay, you can share resources, but there's no specialization here. They all are exactly the same. Okay, so what distinguishes a multicellular organism from a colony of cells is division of labor. Okay, among the cells. All of these cells in that organism all do everything. Okay, they collect food, they process waste, they exchange gases, they all do all of that. Okay, whereas in a multicellular organism, there would be specialization, okay, in cells, so that some cells do this and some cells do that. Specialized cells make up tissue. Okay, tissue makes up organs, and then organs make up systems. All right, so within your liver, okay, there are liver cells that make up liver tissue. All of that liver tissue makes up the organ, okay, the liver, and that's part of the digestive system. Okay, everyone kind of follow me on that? Okay, so that's kind of the breakdown of the hierarchy of things. You wouldn't see that in a colonial organism like this one. All right, so we had increasing specialization. Okay, that was big. Okay, the more specialized things become, okay, the better able they are to adapt to their environment. If you're just looking at bacteria, okay, while they may be well adapted to their environment because they are very simple with no specialization, a change in their environment could kill them all. All right, that's what antibiotics do. All right, they create a change in the environment, your body, that kills the bacteria. Okay, they don't survive, right, and then they're gone. Right, so that's what we're looking at there. A more complex organism may be better able to adapt. Okay, so increasing cellular specialization and division of labor, right? So those are our big things there. This allows the division of labor to work better. Okay, so in the colonial aggregates, all cells would have been the same. Maybe they were all mobile, they had flagella, etc. Okay, as cells in the colony tended to become interdependent, that is dependent on each other. Okay, some of the cells may have lost their flagella as they became specialized to do a certain job. Remember, that's not the organism per se, that's over the course of time, the species changed. Okay. Now, looking at these diagrams here, these are all kind of artist conceptions of what early Earth would have looked like. Okay, what do you notice in these pictures? A big moon. Why is the moon big in all of them? It's closer to the Earth. Okay, the Earth and the moon are getting further apart. Every year, they get further apart by about 2 centimeters. Now, that doesn't seem like much, but when you consider that over 4.5 billion years, that adds up to a long way. Okay, so the moon was much closer to the Earth when it first formed. That would mean greater tidal forces. Okay, so how many people have ever been like to the ocean, like the Bay of Fundy, kind of that kind? Yeah, right. Like in some places, tides can be very big. Okay, well, imagine the moon is exponentially closer than it is now. Okay, tides would have been huge. Okay, they could have moved miles inland every single day, and they would have done it several times a day. Right? We got like 2 high tides, 2 low tides now in every day. If the moon is closer, not only is its gravitational pull greater, but it whips around the Earth a lot faster. Okay, it would have orbited the Earth maybe twice a day. All right, so that would mean way more tides, okay, than it is now. It orbits the Earth once every 28 point something days. Okay, so it's a lot further away now. So imagine seeing the moon, okay, going around and around like this. Okay, it would have meant the ocean was going in and out all the time. Okay, creating a much different environment in the tidal flats than there is now. Okay, and that's where we believe, or at least the fossil record tells us, okay, that the first life evolved was in these kind of tidal areas. And that would have been the stratoliths. That's what you see here, those photosynthesizing bacteria. Okay, you also see in all of these pictures a lot more volcanic activity. Okay, you see more frequent meteor activity. Okay, obviously there was a lot more debris floating around, okay, at that time, and so as a result, there would have been more impacts. Right, now that the solar system looks a lot different, okay, the planets are like in different places, believe it or not now. Jupiter actually protects us quite a bit. Okay, Jupiter's like your big brother on the football field or on the playground. He protects you from bullies, okay, like asteroids, because it's so big, okay, and it's got so much gravity that it actually alters the trajectories of a lot of things as they come in. And in fact, trailing it and leading it, okay, are 2 kind of junkyards. It's maybe not the right word, but it's kind of what they are. Okay, that contain lots of asteroids. Okay, we call them the Jovian Trojans. Okay, they are just these rocks that it's captured that follow it in its orbit, okay, around. A lot of those things would have hit Earth were it not for Jupiter being where it is. Okay. All right. Questions there? All right, so we're going to look at some examples of specialized cells. And what we're going to look at are cells in a plant. Okay, the plant is going to be our example of a multicellular organism in Science 10. In Bio 20, okay, you'll look at other organisms, you'll look at animals, you do the fetal pig dissection, okay, all that kind of stuff. But for us, we're going to look at plants, okay, as multicellular organisms with examples of specialization. So the first cells that we're going to look at in a plant are what we call parenchyma cells. Okay? Parenchyma cells are also sometimes referred to as stem cells, and not because they're in the stem. Okay, stem cells are unspecialized cells that can become anything. Right? So a plant has a ready supply of these cells on hand at all times. Right? Usually they're in the areas of new growth, tips of roots, tips of shoots, okay, things like that. So if a plant is growing and says, okay, we need more leaf tissue, the stem cells will develop into leaf tissue. Okay, if they're in the roots, they'll develop into root tissue. If it needs them to grow new buds so that it can have branches in another place, that's what they'll become. Okay, that's kind of the miracle of stem cells, is that they are unspecialized cells that with the proper chemical signal can essentially become anything the organism needs. Okay, how many people have heard of stem cells before? Okay, but probably in the context of medical research for people. Yes, stem cell research, right? Okay, so there's different kinds of stem cells for people. Okay, there's pluripotent stem cells, which you have in your body. Okay, they are not able to become anything, but they can become many things. All right, they're applications for medical science are quite numerous. In fact, what they've been used for lately is to help regrow connective tissue. Okay, so what they'll do is you can find these pluripotent stem cells in a number of places. They're often in bone marrow, but they're also in fatty tissue, because it's something I've actually been looking into for myself. They harvest some of the fatty tissue. Essentially, they give you a little lipo. Okay, that's not why I was looking into it. Okay, but they pull it out and they centrifuge it. They concentrate it and then they inject it into a joint. Okay, elbow, knee, shoulder. Okay, something like that. And what they found is that those stem cells will regrow into cartilage. Okay, and other types of connective tissue, allowing you to overcome osteoarthritis, okay, which you guys don't have yet, but hopefully you won't have to deal with, okay, where you wear down, tear, otherwise somehow destroy your cartilage in a joint, okay, that leads to lots of inflammation and swelling and stuff like that, okay. This allows you to regrow the cartilage that was previously lost, okay. So that's the whole idea behind stem cells, is being able to regrow certain tissues, okay. The other kind of stem cells are embryonic stem cells. Okay, where do you suppose they come from? From an embryo, right? Okay, so the only way to get embryonic stem cells is to harvest them from an embryo. Okay, now that is the embryonic stem cell research has a lot of moral opposition. Okay, including the Catholic Church. We oppose embryonic stem cell research because it's going to end with the death of the embryo. Okay, so if they are harvesting embryonic stem cells, the embryo will die. Okay, because they're taking cells out of the embryo that were destined to become something. Okay, like when the egg is first fertilized, you get like a zygote, and then you get a gastrula and a blastula, basically just a bigger and bigger ball of cells. Okay, when it gets to a certain size, specialization begins to occur. Okay, and it folds in and creates a tube. Okay, the hollow tube is actually what becomes your brain and spinal cord. Okay, so if they were to harvest cells from there, they would be able to grow nerve tissue. Okay, and they've even found that in rats, they can take this nerve tissue, graft it across broken spinal cords, and rats would regain use of their legs. Not full, but they would regain some ability to use their legs after the kind of transplantation of the cells. Okay, if they take cells that were destined to become the liver, they can actually grow and culture liver tissue, which can then be grafted onto a person who has a malfunctioning liver, okay? Or a person with diabetes, okay? They can get a pancreatic transplant, or not transplant, but a pancreatic graft, which is grown pancreas tissue grafted onto their pancreas. It can make insulin, and they're no longer diabetic, all right? So it's got obviously much greater range in terms of its ability to treat certain things. The problem is that we're trading, at least from a Catholic perspective, we're trading the life of the embryo for someone else, okay? And we don't believe it's right to kill something, okay? And that's what we believe we're doing, because as Catholics, we believe at the moment of conception is when life begins, okay? So taking an embryo and harvesting stem cells from it, we believe to be morally wrong for that reason, okay? So plants, though, don't have this moral problem because they have their own stem cells that they can use at any time, okay? Called parenchyma cells, right? And they can become anything they want. All right, questions there? Okay, there's lots of like morally heavy stuff today for a Monday. Okay, water conducting cells within the plants. Okay, water conducting cells are part of what we call the xylem. Okay, the xylem is a series of tubes, okay, that run through vascular plants that carry water. Okay, so water conducting tubes have to be A, fairly watertight, and B, very, very small, and C, very, very strong. Right? It is actually old xylem cells that become the hard part of the trunk of a tree. They become wood. Okay, so they have to have lots of fibers in them, things like that that are very strong to help support things. So they are specialized in that way. They're long, they're skinny, okay, they're fibrous, they're water resistant or watertight. Okay, you can see they have these tapered ends, okay, that they kind of fit together, okay, kind of a wedge almost. Okay, that's what creates the kind of watertight nature of them, right? But they're very specialized to do one job. These cells don't carry out photosynthesis, right? They're in the trunk of the tree or in the thick part of the stem, okay? There's no light to be had there. Their job isn't to carry out photosynthesis. Their job is to provide tubes that will carry water, okay, from the roots to the leaves. Okay, everybody all right with that? Okay, food conducting cells. All right, so in a plant, the problem a plant faces is that water and nutrients are in the dirt, sunlight is not. Okay, so it's got to be able to transport materials in two different directions. It's got to transport water and nutrients up the tree. It's got to transport sugar down. It can't obviously use the same tubes for that. Okay, it has to. That would be like running, two trains on the same track towards each other. Right? That's not going to work well. So it's got separate sets of tubes. The xylem tubes that carry the water are on the inside of the stem. The phloem tubes are on the outside of the stem. Right? The phloem tubes are what carry the sugar that's made in the leaves down to the roots that can't make their own sugar. Why can't the roots make their own sugar? It's dark. Yeah, they're underground. Right? So they can't do it. They actually have chloroplasts in their cells, but they can't do anything because they don't get light. All right, so the sugary sap goes down the phloem on the outside. So how many people have ever gotten like sticky sap on their fingers? Right? It's always just right on the outside, like right underneath the bark, okay, is where you find that. So they're built quite a bit differently because they carry a very viscous material. Okay, they're going to have what are called sieve plates, okay, which are essentially a grill that's spaced periodically as they go down. Carrying this sugary sap means that sometimes the sugar will crystallize. You don't want a crystal in these tubes because it could block the tube. So what happens is there's these sieve plates that the crystals will hit, and then the weight of the sap from above will smash them, right? Keeping them from getting too big and blocking the tube. Right, so once they're smashed, they fit through the sieve plates, and then we get the smooth flow of sap. Okay. If a plant gets damaged on the outside, okay, then it won't be able to transport the sugars down to the roots. Okay, I learned this actually from a guy I went to university with. He was in forestry, and I was in education, but we stayed at the same dorm, and we had this nice field out behind our dorm where we would play football and stuff like that, and it was great because it's a big grassy open area. The forestry department decided they were rescuing some trees from somewhere, big, mature, giant trees. They rescued them from wherever they were, brought in these big tree spades and planted them right in the middle of our awesome field. Kind of hard to play football, you're going out for a long pass like this and you run into a tree. Okay? So we weren't too happy about this. So anyway, we asked Tree Mugger, that was his nickname because he was in forestry. Tree Mugger, not tree hugger. Okay. We said, like, well, what are we going to do? Like, we can't go out there with a chainsaw and cut them down. Like, we'll get caught. He's like, don't worry, I got it. And he took this small piece of cable, and he went out and he said, I'm going to ring these trees. So instead of cutting them down, he just went out there with the cable and walked around the tree in a circle like this, running the cable back and forth. He only cut into the tree maybe about a centimeter. Okay? But he cut through the phloem cells that carry the sugar down to the roots. So now the sugar couldn't get to the roots. Trees got really, really sick, okay, because their roots were starving. Now, this plan backfired on us horribly. The forestry department saw that these trees were getting sick, and since they just transplanted them, they were worried about them, and they were trying to figure out what went wrong, and they saw tree muggers' handiwork. So they made paper mache skin grafts for these trees. And I kid you not, it was paper mache, like newspaper, paper mache. Okay, they took this stuff and they grafted it into and over the cut that he had made in each of the trees. And over the course of my time at the university, the trees actually grew right over the paper mache, just like a skin graft. Okay, like you could actually see in the bark on these trees, you could see like the funnies and the text and stuff like that that were in the newspaper that they had used, okay, to graft over this, and it just formed up. Because I mean, what's newspaper made out of? Trees, right? And so it worked. Yeah, it was crazy. Anyway, it's an interesting story that has to do with what we talked about. Maybe it's not interesting to you, but I enjoy telling it because it's funny. Okay, so specialized cells. Okay, they transport this food down to the roots. Okay, and they have these sieve plates. That's kind of their specialized thing, but they're definitely tube shaped. Okay, leaf structure. This one's super important. Like circle this slide. Okay, the layers of the leaf are going to be our prime example of specialization. So on an exam, when I ask you about specialization, you want to talk about the layers of the leaf. Okay. When you looked at the plant cell the other day, this is what you looked at. Okay, this diagram here on the right. You looked at the layers of the leaf. You were only concerned with the plant cells that were here, okay, only a single cell, okay, but the leaf, as you can see, has cells that are very different, okay. There's these ones on the top, okay, and on the bottom, which are called the epidermis, the upper and lower epidermis, okay. These cells are not there to carry out photosynthesis. These cells are there to secrete a waxy cuticle. If you've ever felt the leaves of a plant, okay, they feel kind of waxy. Okay, that waxy cuticle is secreted by those cells to prevent water from being lost. Okay, water can't move through wax, man. Yep. Okay, water can't move through the waxy layer, so they can only evaporate water from very small holes in this cuticle, which means they don't dry out nearly as quickly. A moss, for example, cannot secrete a cuticle. So if you put a moss out in the sun, like within an hour, it's just crunchy, okay? But other plants can survive that because they're only losing water through very small holes on the bottom of the leaf in the cuticle. Okay, we'll talk about those in a minute because they're also specialized cells. But okay, so the epidermis secretes the cuticle. That's its specialized job. They're transparent to allow the light to go through. Okay, their job is to just essentially limit evaporation. Below those is what we call the palisade layer. That's the layer that you looked at in the cell anatomy lab. Okay? The palisade layer contains cells that are densely packed and full of chloroplasts. What do you suppose their job is? Photosynthesis. That is the layer that carries out photosynthesis because it's on the top of the leaf. Okay? The top of the leaf is the part that receives the most sunshine. Okay, so we pack them in there and we carry out as much photosynthesis as possible. Below that, okay, or kind of in the middle of that, we see the cells we just talked about a few minutes ago, okay, the water-conducting cells of the xylem, okay, the food-conducting cells of the phloem, those are in there, they're specialized cells, they're in veins, right? You've probably seen that on the surface of a leaf there are veins, okay? They're not veins like ours, they're analogous, okay? They're like that, but not quite the same, but they carry materials to and from, okay, the roots. Okay, and you can actually see that right here in the real picture. Okay, that's a lateral vein. They only caught part of it, but it would be running in behind these cells here on the right. Now, below the palisade layer is what we call the spongy layer. And you can see that the cells don't have any real particular shape in there. They're just kind of random, but there are spaces in between them. Okay, quite a few spaces in between them. All right, in those spaces are going to be carbon dioxide, water, and oxygen. These spaces are where the gas exchange that supports photosynthesis occurs. All right, so that's where the carbon dioxide comes in and is absorbed by the cells. The oxygen they produce is put back into these spaces and allowed to escape through the holes in the cuticle, which we'll talk about in a minute. All right, so we got the waxy cuticle, the upper epidermis, okay? You guys don't need to know the word mesophyll, just palisade and spongy layers, okay? This is the spongy layer that we just talked about because it's got spaces in it like a sponge. And the air spaces are labeled there as well. Now, on the lower epidermis, okay, so that's what we got here, there are stomates. The stomates are the little holes I was talking about before. Each stomate is made up of two very special cells called guard cells, right? Those are also labeled on this diagram here. The stomate can actually open and close. When will a plant close that stomate? If it's going to be closed, it's usually during the day. Okay, it's open most of the time, but it'll only close it, okay, kind of later in the day when a lot of evaporation has occurred and it's starting to, well, not so much be concerned about water, it's kind of personifying it a bit, but okay, essentially a lot of water has been lost and the plant needs to limit how much more is lost. It's not a conscious choice because obviously a plant has no brain. This is actually just due to osmosis, right? We talked about osmosis last week. Osmosis is the movement of water across the membrane to, yeah, to, well, not to lower so much, but to balance, right? To balance concentrations. So what happens is, as water is evaporating through these, salt gets left behind, okay? Because the water that a plant pulls out of the ground contains lots of minerals. Well, they can't, the minerals don't go with the water when it evaporates, they get left behind, which starts to create kind of a salty solution in the leaf and around the guard cells. So as that salt concentration increases, water starts to move out of the guard cells by osmosis. And as that water moves out of the guard cells, their shape changes to close the stomate. Okay? It's completely automatic, it's completely passive, okay? But it also limits the amount of water that can evaporate from the leaf at any one time. Okay? So very specialized cells performing a function, okay, for the organism. All right, so layers of the leaf, super important. Okay, see the same thing here. It's not as good a diagram, okay, but basically just more stuff about what everything is doing. Okay, questions on the layer of the leaf? Layers of the leaf? Okay. I would expect to see that diagram again and again, okay, or that you should be able to refer to it when you're answering a question about multicellularity. All right, so this is what I just explained here with the stomates. So this is what the guard cells and the stomate look like under a microscope, right? So this would be a stomate right here. These two red cells would be the guard cells, right? When the plant has got a lot of water, okay, then water moves into the guard cells and they get really tight, okay? That is, they get like stretched, and when they stretch, they have a shape like a bean, okay? And so then the stomate is open. As the day progresses and water evaporates, the salt concentrations around them start to increase and water moves out of those cells by osmosis, okay, to balance the salt concentrations, which closes the stomate off, okay, later in the day. All right, so if you're looking at that from the side, this is what they look like when they're open, okay, this is what they look like when they're closed, okay, they just change shape and close off, right? Highlight this. There has never been a unit exam where I did not ask how a plant regulates water loss from its leaves. Okay? That is one of the ways plants regulate water loss from the leaves. What's the other way? You got stomates that can open and close, and the whole leaf is covered in a waxy cuticle. Okay? Those are the two main ways that a plant can regulate its water loss. Okay, so stomates, guard cells, waxy cuticle. Okay, remember it's the epidermis that secretes that waxy cuticle. Okay, so like we've gone over, a fair number of examples of specialized cells within the plant. There's obviously way more than that, okay? And the reason we go over plants is that theirs are much more uniformly laid out, easy to find, as opposed to looking at a multicellular animal, okay? Where there's just even more different examples of specialized cells and their locations are less concrete. And so that's why we use the plant in grade 10. All right, so got 4 questions here, guys. I want you to answer those questions in your own words, good complete sentences. Yeah, I'll give you about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll go over those together, okay? All right, so why was multicellularity so superior to unicellularity? All right. Right, so there were niches that the multicellular organisms could fill that couldn't be filled by a unicellular organism, so they had an advantage there in terms of acquiring food and things like that. Okay, what else?
The cell dies in multicellular organism, or the whole thing dies. So they can be a little bit more give.
Oh, okay, so if a cell dies in a multicellular organism, the organism doesn't die.
Yeah.
Okay, right, yes, that would certainly be an advantage. Right, what else? What did it allow them to be compared to unicellular organisms? Bigger. Okay, that's a huge, huge advantage. Being bigger, okay, means that there are less things that can prey on you. All right, so bigger, more complex. Okay, that again, the complexity allowed them to fill the niches that were previously unavailable to unicellular organisms. All right, so all those things are definitely a big part of that. Specialization, okay, big part of that as well. That means doing some jobs much better than a unicellular organism could have performed them. Okay, so yeah, definitely those things, okay, for sure. Now, how are the cells of the leaf different from cells found in the stem of a plant? Okay, what's the job of the leaf? To make sugar. All right, primarily that is the photosynthetic organ of the plant, which means they need to have lots and lots of surface area, chloroplasts, cells to carry out photosynthesis. Right, they're much more densely packed. Okay, meanwhile the stem, its primary job is not photosynthesis, it's transport and support. Okay, so it's got to have a very tubular nature. Okay, tubes to transport water, tubes to transport sugar. Okay, those tubes have to be very strong, but also flexible, right? And very small. Yes. Okay. In order to transport water up the plant, the tubes are essentially microscopic. Okay, there's millions of them, but they're all very, very small. Okay, all right, so that's good. Describe how the epidermis and the stomates have similar jobs. What is their job? Exactly, control the amount of water evaporated from the plant. It's crucial that they regulate water loss because water is important for photosynthesis. Okay, the stomate. All right, we talked about this a couple of times, but the stomate uses osmosis or osmotic pressure, to be more accurate, to open and close. Okay, during the day, as water evaporates, salts build up, salt concentrations build up near the stomate, which pulls water out of the stomate through osmosis, closing the stomate. All right, so you would need to mention, okay, like some stuff about osmosis and osmotic pressure if you were explaining how a stomate worked, okay, and how that can open and close it. Okay, any other questions on that stuff? Okay.